Welcome everyone to the Boston Office 365 user group. This is our August 2021 session. The organizers of our group are all three of us are here with you today. We've got Dimitri from Turn Digital, and myself. I'm with Wellington Street Consulting, and Mr. Bill, who is here with the Executive Office of Technology and Services Security. We have actually made a bunch of progress on getting our YouTube videos up and running, our previous presentations. So please feel free to visit our YouTube channel and check those out. We're still a little bit behind, but we're getting really close. So more on that later.
I think we're up to date. We have all those on there.
Oh, okay, cool. Awesome.
Big thanks to Bill for getting us all caught up.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Bill. That's wonderful. All right, so we are going to go over some Office 365 updates. These are a handful of the updates that have come out since last time we met. Now, we actually didn't meet last month, so this is actually going to be 2 months worth of updates that we're going to go through, but we're going to kind of skim over these relatively quickly. And if you guys have any questions about any particular updates, feel free to either just raise your hand or pop something in the chat about the name of the update that you want to hear more about, or feel free to ask a specific question if you'd like. All right, so getting started. Microsoft Planner now has a feature that will automatically suggest attachments to new tasks that are created. This is something that is available now, so everybody should actually see this feature now in their tenant if you're in the commercial tenants. And all suggestions are still security trimmed. And this was something that I felt deserved a dedicated slide because I personally was really excited about this. Microsoft has finally given us the option to control how the default behavior for files that are stored in Microsoft Teams. So for all of your Microsoft Office files, you can set whether or not you want it to open in Teams, on the desktop app, or within the browser. This feature is rolling out now, and the rollout is expected to be finished by the end of August. Also important to note, this setting is device specific, which makes sense. So you can set this up to only do desktop app on the devices where you have that desktop app installed. All right, and we've got a bunch of updates here on Microsoft Teams. This is specifically Microsoft Teams meetings. So there were actually so many updates just about meetings. I grouped those onto their own slide. There's now a more advanced or a redo of the graphical user interface for breakout rooms that actually highly facilitates assigning people to rooms in a much cleaner fashion. We have attendance reports. Attendance reports are now available in a graphical fashion. It won't just download the files, but in the meeting, you can go back and take a look at it. Live annotations are available in PowerPoint. So this is available if you share your PowerPoint as a PowerPoint file through the team. You can annotate on it live. There is also Standout Mode, which is available. So that looks like this. Hi. And there's also slide translation, which is available. Again, this is only if the slide is shared through Teams itself. That translation can be done in up to, I believe, 8 different languages as of right now. Spotlight has now been upgraded so that you can spotlight multiple people. Up to 7 people can be spotlighted. And we also now have chat bubbles. Chat bubbles are wonderful if you're doing like a solo presentation and you're sharing your screen like I'm doing now. I don't have to have the chat pane open. Any new chats actually pop up in a little bubble right at the top of my screen, so I can see those without pulling me away from my presentation. It's a really nice feature. The other one I'm also a big fan of, and that's the ability to lock the meeting. This is a great function for preventing people that are doing sort of meeting bombs, or if you're doing anything sort of a high security deal. And the way that that works is basically after you have all of the attendees in a meeting that you're expecting, you have the option of locking that meeting, which will prevent anyone new from joining that meeting. And also polls that are done inside Teams can now be done as quizzes that have correct answers. So you can mark a correct answer and people will instantly know whether the answer that they chose was correct or not. All right. Other Teams updates. Oh, I didn't remove breakout rooms from this one. We already talked about that. Approval flows. So approval flows in Teams aren't new, but what is new is they've added a bunch of templates to the approval flows so people can get started in a much quicker way now. So for those that are less experienced with Flow, it's easier to kind of hop in and hit the ground running. We now have an interface for setting up out of office via Microsoft Teams. And there is also a high fidelity music mode that enables the broadcast of music through Microsoft Teams. And SharePoint. So SharePoint now has email notification management that has been centralized. So if you go to the SharePoint homepage and click on the settings cog in the top right button and then select email notification settings, you can actually toggle on and off what types of notifications you want to receive via email from SharePoint. Also, events within SharePoint can now be audience targeted in the same fashion that things like the navigation components can also be audience targeted. And for site page creators, Microsoft has now released collapsible sections. So within that, you can determine whether the startup state of a section and I believe the widths at which it can be collapsed. All right. And I just wanted to give a huge thanks to our platinum sponsor, Turn Digital. Turn Digital has been a sponsor for us for multiple years now, and they've done a lot to help us keep the lights on and help keep you guys informed about what's going on in the world of Microsoft 365. And we really appreciate that. And we really look forward to someday going back to being in person where they can buy us some pizza. But in the meantime, Mr. Rob Windsor is here with us today, and he's going to give us an introduction to the Microsoft Identity Platform. So Rob, whenever you're ready, take it away.
So as Mike mentioned, this session is Introduction to the Microsoft Identity Platform. And my name's Rob Windsor. My contact info is here on this first slide. I'll put it up again at the end. So there's my email, rwindsor@paygroup.com, and my Twitter handle @RobWindsor. So my plan for this talk is to do a couple slides, then do a demo, and then come back to the slides, and then finish up with 1 or 2 demos, depending on the time available. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in chat. I'm not sure, Mike, Dimitri, is it okay if they come off mute and ask questions as well?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, awesome. So a little bit about myself. I'm a lead consultant with Pate Group. Pate's a SharePoint consultancy out of Cincinnati, but we're basically a remote company. Most of, like I live in Toronto. There's people in the company that live all over North America. So we do Office 365, Azure consulting. If you're interested in that, feel free to send me an email or ping me on Twitter. I'm also a Microsoft MVP for Office development, and I ran a user group in Toronto for like 11 years. It's been a while since that, but I still try to keep active in user group communities. I don't know, some of you might recognize me. I worked for quite a while in the Boston area in Wakefield and Woburn. I've presented at the Boston SharePoint user group a couple times, and I presented at SharePoint Saturday Boston and SP Tech on Boston many times. So Boston has a warm place in my heart, and I can't wait to be able to get back and visit in person. So what's the Microsoft Identity Platform? It's I think it's a sort of fancy name for basically just Azure Active Directory, authentication, and token exchange, really. So the Identity Platform, it starts out with the Azure portal, where you can register applications and configure them. There's also an authentication library called MSAL that you can use to then communicate with the application that you've registered in the Azure portal. And really, the 2 big things you want to do is authenticate with Azure and get what's called an access token. And then you can use that access token to access protected resources like the Microsoft Graph or the SharePoint Client Object Model or other protected APIs. And you can authenticate with this platform using your work and school accounts, or basically your Azure AD accounts, personal accounts like your Outlook or Hotmail or Xbox, and other non-Microsoft accounts like your Gmail account or Facebook, LinkedIn, which is Microsoft, but it's not part of the identity platform. So really what we're going to do is just walk through the process of, I've described this at a very high level. What's the actual mechanics of doing this, and how do we use it? What benefits do we get from it? So a couple standards that are important here, OAuth 2 and OpenID, in terms of token exchanges and the authentication flows. There are the main open source library is MSAL. It's the one I mentioned on the last slide. There's actually MSAL for several different platforms and languages. So we'll be using msal.net in this particular session. But there's a Java version. There's a version for React. There's lots of different versions. I have a slide that covers that a little bit later on. We'll talk about working with the application management portal where we can register applications and manage them. I'm not going to get too much into the configuration API and PowerShell, but there are basically ways that you can do what I'm going to do in the portal, but automate it, right? So there's a CLI, there's PowerShell, there's APIs that you can use to register applications, manage those applications, and so on. And then part of the identity platform is also just content like documentation, Microsoft Learn courses, samples, all the kind of stuff that you would kind of expect when Microsoft presents developer content and technology as they have here. All right, so like I said, I'm going to walk through the main parts of all of this in a demo so you can see it in context. And then we'll come back and describe what I did in the demo in more detail by looking at the slides. So I have a Chrome profile here. This is a user who has tenant admin privileges in one of my developer tenants. If you're not familiar with that, you can get a free developer tenant. So Microsoft Developer Office 365 developer tenant. Join the so you go to the developer program here. There's a short link for this, so I can't remember what it is off the top of my head. But basically, you can join. You can register with this, and it gets you a free developer tenant. Right now, this has evolved over time, but it's a 25 user, I think it's E5 tenant that lasts for 3 months. And Microsoft monitors your tenant, and if you continue to use it during that 3 months, then they'll extend you for 3 months, and that just happens automatically. Another really cool thing are these sample data packs. Like you can get sample users and just add them into your tenant. You can get sample mail items, events, and so on. And they're adding in sample packs as time goes on. Okay, and if you want, let's see, if we just go to YouTube here, and then just search for Rob Windsor Office 365 dev tenant would be good, or developer tenant. I have a video that walks through the creation process, so from start to end. There's an ad there at the beginning, but you can see exactly how you go and create your own developer tenant. All right, so that's exactly what I have here. And what I want to do is create some applications that are authenticated and protected by Azure AD. So the first thing I'm going to do is go to the Azure portal. So you don't need any special license to be able to go and register apps in the Azure portal. You can get to the portal just by going to portal.azure.com. If you want a thinned down view of the portal specific to app registration, then you can go to aad.portal.azure.com. And it just gives you a reduced set of functionality. And the big thing is here under Azure Active Directory. That's where you want to go in the main left-hand nav. And then in the secondary left-hand nav, you want to go to app registrations. And here's where you can see the apps that are currently registered in your tenant. And you can create new app registrations. So I'm going to click New Registration here to create a new app registration. So it's going to ask me what the name is, and just use a standard naming convention here so I can match stuff up. So I'll call this Boss 365 Client Credentials Console. Okay, and I'll explain why I use the name Client Credentials in there. So what are the supported account types? So do you want people from just your tenant to be able to use this application? Do you want people from any tenant to be able to use your application? Do you want people from your other tenants and people who have personal accounts to be able to use your application, or you just want people with personal accounts to be able to use your application? So for this particular example, I'm just going to start out by saying I only want people in my tenant to be able to access and use this application. Okay. And then there's a thing called a redirect URI. So as I mentioned in the intro, one of the important things in this entire process is getting what's called an access token. So Azure gives you an access token, and that token basically says, yes, this person has authenticated and they have rights. Well, actually, it's not. I should say this person. This entity has authenticated with Azure, and they have rights to do certain things. So when you go to call a protected resource, you pass that token that you've been given, and then that resource can go validate it and say, is this person who they say they are? Do they have the rights to do what they say they can do? And if so, then okay, we'll give you access to the resource. Otherwise, we'll, say that you're unauthorized. So you can configure that here. I'll show you. The redirect URI is important because Azure can only give tokens to URLs or URIs that you've explicitly authorized within the registration. And we'll see the where you can actually do that. So I'm just going to go ahead and register this app here. And on the overview page, there's one really important thing, and that's the application ID right here. Okay. Whoops. Okay, so this ID uniquely identifies this Azure app against all other Azure apps, not just in this tenant, but across all tenants. Okay, so that's how you uniquely identify this particular application through that, using that GUID. And that'll eventually, as we'll see as we get through the example, become what we use as the username for the app. Okay, so for this particular app, what I want to do is be able to go and get information about SharePoint lists in a SharePoint site. Okay, so, actually, sorry, I've just gotten a little bit ahead of myself. The first thing I need to do is just tell the app tell Azure what kind of app am I building, and we do that through authentication here on the left, secondary left-hand nav, and then we say add a platform. So, am I building a web application, a spa? Am I building a mobile application? Am I building a desktop application? I'm going to be using a console app, so it's a desktop app. So I'll click that, and then I'm going to get sort of a context-sensitive set of configuration over here in this panel for the kind of app I'm building. So it's really trying to guide you through the process and let you know what information does Azure need for that specific kind of application. And for this one, I just need to say what the redirect URI is, and it's just this native client. So login.microsoft online common OAuth to native client. So that says that Azure can send tokens to this native client application. So I'll go ahead and click configure here. Now I mentioned getting information about SharePoint lists. So now I'm going to go to API permissions. Okay. So this application needs to request permissions to be able to access protected resources. And it does that through these API permission requests. So right now, it's requested the user.read permission from the Microsoft Graph. I want to add a new permission request for the Microsoft Graph, so I'll click Add Permission. So Microsoft Graph will be, especially if you're working with Office 365, it will be the main API you use. You can get access to a lot of information in Office 365. Well, actually, really your Microsoft 365 tenant as well from this API, but you can't get everything. So there are other APIs as well, for example, SharePoint, right? So one of the things you can't do with SharePoint is create a view using the graph today. It doesn't support that. So if I wanted to create a SharePoint list and then create a view, I'd have to fall back to using the SharePoint REST API or the client object model. So I would then ask for permissions to be able to do that from SharePoint specifically. So you can see there's lots of other APIs here that are available, and you can create your own custom APIs that you can use as well. I'm not going to get into that in this session, but I can show you some resources that talk about how to do that. So to get the list information, I'm going to use the Microsoft Graph. And then it's going to ask me, do I want to request delegated permissions or application permissions? So delegated permissions are permissions that you delegate to the app on behalf of a user. So when you're using delegated permissions, there's always going to be a signed in user. Okay. So let's actually we're not going to use them, but let's just go into here and let's go to calendar. If if I spell it right. There, so calendar. So I want to read from the current user's calendar, right? This is a permission we're going to request in a later demo. So I can request this for the app. And with delegated permissions, the app has to have the permission it's requested, and the user has to have the permission to access the resource for any interaction with the resource to succeed. Right now, basically, a user is going to have rights to read their calendar. So here, with calendars.read, it doesn't really matter that much, right? But let's go to sites here, like sites.read.all. So this is basically to read out of any SharePoint site within the tenant. Well, the app can request that permission on behalf of the user, but individual users might not have rights to read across all sites, right? They might have rights to read from no sites or a subsection of sites. So in the cases where the user doesn't have permission to read from a site, the request to do so will fail, even if the app has been granted the permission at sites.read.all. Okay, so in delegated permissions, it's the intersection of the user permissions and the app permissions that determine whether or not any task will fail, or you can at least try to do it. Now, with application permissions, the user, there's generally not a user, but there actually can be a signed-in user. So when there's not a user, an example would be I'm running an Azure function that runs on a timer, right? So there is no signed-in user. So I'm going to use application permission. In the case where there is a signed-in user, maybe you want to do something that the current user won't have permission to do. Like I want to create a site collection, right? Well, there's a decent chance that if I'm going to use this for multiple users, that not all users can create a site collection. So in that case, you can have like an API that uses application permissions to do that task without having to have the signed-in user have rights to do the task. Right. So with application permissions, the effective permissions are whatever permissions have been granted to the app. The user permissions are not taken into account at all when you try to access a specific resource. So for this example, we're going to use application permissions. And I want to, again, just search for sites. And I want the sites.read.all permission. Okay. So I want to be able to find out list information from any site within the tenant. So I'll go ahead and just click Add Permissions. Actually, before I do that, up here at the top under Microsoft Graph, you see that https://graph.microsoft.com. That's what's called the resource identifier for this API. So the actual full name of this permission request is https://graph.microsoft.com/sites.read.all. Okay. So when you are writing this in code, the permission request, which we'll see an example of later on, that's how you would describe it. For SharePoint, there's not one single resource identifier. It's tenant specific. So it's your tenant name.sharepoint.com/ the permission request or permission scope, right? These are all things called permission scopes. Okay, so when you're writing this in code, if it's the graph, you don't have to include the resource identifier. You can't, it's optional whether you include the graph.microsoft.com part. But for every other API, including APIs that you create custom, you have to include both the resource identifier and the permission scope when you're defining what scopes you're requesting. Okay, so now I'll go ahead and click Add Permissions here. And you can see that that permission request now shows up here in my configured permissions. So I could add additional permission requests should I need them, but I don't for this particular example. Now, I've only requested these permissions. They have to be granted. And in the case of application permissions, they need to be granted by someone who's a tenant admin or who has Azure application admin rights within the tenant. So in this particular case, I'm just going to use this grant admin consent because it needs to be consented by an admin. I am. That button does what I could do by navigating to a URL with a specific format, it's just easier to just use this button here. So I'll click the button and click yes. And then you'll see over here, these permission requests have now been granted. So they've been granted for all users because I'm an admin. I granted that permission for all users within the specific tenant. Okay, so now the last thing is I need to authenticate with Azure AD, but we're using application permissions, so there's no user. So how am I going to authenticate? Well, I mentioned before that this application ID can act as the username for the app. We can then also use a certificate or a secret, a client secret, as the password for the app. Okay, so we can use either one. So we can upload a certificate here and then use that to authenticate. I'm not going to get in. There's a few extra steps that are required, which just take a little bit of extra time for that to work. But I have, if you're interested in how to do that, I have some examples that show how to work with certificates as the password for the app. I'll use the simpler example where we'll just create a client secret. So we'll call this boss 365, and we'll say that the secret lasts for 6 months. And I'll go ahead and click add. And the important thing to understand here is that this value will eventually not show. It'll just show you that there is a value there. So it's generally really important to just copy it right away and throw it in like Notepad or something else for the time being. Okay. If you forget to do that, you can just go ahead and delete it using the trash icon here and then recreate it if you haven't already started using that particular client secret. Okay, so I think that's everything I want to do for this specific example. So for this example, I'm going to use the .NET Framework. I'll do a later example that uses .NET Core. So I'll just say here, File, New Project. And I want to create a .NET Framework console app, which is the template that's there. And I'm going to call this app Client Credentials Console. I just do that so that I can match up the projects in the various projects that I have with what I've registered as an app in the tenant. And I'll go ahead and click Create here. So as I've mentioned previously, the library that I'm going to use to do the authentication and token exchange with Azure AD is called MSAL, or the Microsoft Authentication Library. So to get that, I'll right-click on my project, and I'll say Manage NuGet Packages. And I'm just click Browse here. The MSAL library, or basically the Microsoft Graph, which is the protected resource I'm going to be communicating with, is a REST API. And it's going to give me JSON back when I make requests to it. So I'll just go ahead and add in Newtonsoft JSON to handle the JSON stuff. This has nothing to do with Azure AD or it's just really just handling JSON. So that's done. And now I'll go take a look for MSAL. And the actual NuGet package name is Microsoft Identity.Client here. So I'll go ahead and install that. Okay, so now let's go ahead and just set some parameters here that'll be used in my application. So what's my tenant name? It's Rob Windsor Test 986. So Rob Windsor Test 986. The SharePoint tenant name is Rob Windsor Test 986.sharepoint.com. So I'll just construct that. And then what's the URL to the site I want to work with? It's /site/demo. So we'll add that in, /site/demo. All right, so as I mentioned a couple of times, the the thing we need to be able to communicate with the protected resource is an access token. So let's get some code that will go and get an access token for us. So this confidential client application builder is part of the Microsoft Identity.Client library, the MSAL library. So I need a client ID and client secret. As I mentioned, I need credentials to be able to authenticate with Azure, and we're using the application credentials. So the client secret I copied here into clipboard, into Notepad, sorry. So I'll put that in there. And the client ID is that ID that I've mentioned a couple of times. It's this, or application ID. So client ID and application ID are basically the same thing. They're synonyms. So let's go ahead and grab that. And then I'll put that in there. Okay. So the confidential client application builder is going to return me an object that implements the iConfidential client application. So this is what I can use to communicate with Azure to go and first off authenticate and then get an access token from them or from it. So whether there's two kinds of builders. There's a confidential client application builder. That's the one you use when you're using basically application permissions or app only permissions, or permission requests really. And then there's public client application builder, and you use that when you have like a signed in user. Now, how you authenticate and how this code kind of works depends on the kind of app you're building. So OAuth 2, which is the protocol that this stuff is all built on, has what are called authentication flows. And the different flows depend on the different kind of applications you're building and whether or not there's currently a signed-in user. So how you register apps in the Azure portal and then how you interact with those apps in your code is going to be dependent on the authentication flow that you're using. We're using what's called the client credentials flow in this particular example. And it's one of the most simple flows that you can use. Okay, I have a slide that talks about flows in more detail a little bit later on. But in this particular example, what I'm saying is I want to build this client confidential application that works with a specific tenant. Okay, so it's my tenant, Rob Windsor test 986, and I can identify my tenant using this string. Instead of using tenantname.onmicrosoft.com, I could also identify my tenant using its GUID. You can find that right here, the tenant ID. That would work as well. I just find it less readable when you use GUIDs in your code. And I want to use this client secret. Okay, and so the client ID is being passed here, and the client secret's being passed here. So I want to use that client ID and that client secret in that tenant to request permissions for the Microsoft graph. So this graph.microsoft.com/default represents a set of permission scopes. And the .default is a specific identifier that says whatever permission requests have been configured for the app in the portal, those are the permission requests that I want to use. I could also, instead of specifying the request in the portal for specific kinds of flows, define the permission request that I want right here in my code. Now I can only do that when I'm using the delegated permissions. You can't do that when you're using application permissions. Okay, so if you're using application permission requests, you have to define the request in the portal. If you're doing delegated permission requests, you can define them in your code rather than in the portal itself. And the other nice thing, so defining them in the portal is called static permission requests. Defining them in code is called dynamic permission requests. The nice thing about dynamic permission requests is you don't have to request all the permissions at the beginning of the app, right? You can basically request permissions as you're using new functionality, right? So those are called incremental permission requests. So if I've already requested and been granted a certain set of permissions, and then I need a new permission, I can then request that, and that will add on to the permissions that have already been granted to my user for the app. That will become a little bit more clear when we see the consent dialogues in the next demo. Okay. So I'm requesting the permissions that have been defined in the portal, which was to be able to read from SharePoint site collections and to be able to read information about the current user. There is no current user, so that one really doesn't matter. And I'm doing it for the app. Okay. So if this all works correctly, I will get a few things, but one of the most important thing is this access token. And it's the access token that I need to be able to then go call the graph. Okay. So let's write the code to go call the graph. Whoops. Okay, so I just need to get a few using statements in here. So I'm just using the HTTP client type to be able to make the request to the graph. Okay, so I'm going to go get an access token. That's a string. And then I'm going to create an HTTP client. And in the authentication header, I'm going to add the word bearer plus the access token that I get back from Azure. And then I'm also going to include that I want in the accept headers that I want to get JSON back. Okay. Now with the graph, getting unless you know the specific GUID identifier for your SharePoint site, getting the lists is a two-step process. So the first step is to get the identifier for the SharePoint site. Let's see, should we write that out to the console? Yeah, let's do that. So just grab this code. So we'll call this the web ID. Okay, so I'll show you what that ID looks like. And then once you have the web ID, then you can go get the lists. So as I mentioned, the graph is a REST API, right? So you're going to make the request to graph.microsoft.com. There's two versions of the graph. There's the V1 version, the production version, and then there's a beta version. So all of the new development happens in the beta version. And V1 is supposed to be stable, but it's sort of additive stable. So they add to V1, but they're not supposed to make breaking changes. They generally don't, but they don't always don't. But generally they don't make breaking changes to the V1 endpoint. Okay. So this says I want to go get this specific SharePoint site. I'm identifying that by the SharePoint tenant and the site URL. And I want to get its ID. And then I can use that ID down here to go get the lists for that site. So again, it's graph.microsoft.com/v1/sites. The /sites there is I'm working with the sites endpoint in the graph. That's the one that you use to work with SharePoint sites. And then I pass in the web ID that I get back, and I'm requesting the lists from that site. Okay, so the result I'm going to get back is an array that has a property called value. So that's what I'm working with here. And then each of the items in that array will have a property called display name, which is the actual name of the list. It'll have other values in there as well, but I'm just going to write out the display name. Okay, so again, I'm using the MSAL library to get an access token, And then I'm using that access token when I make calls to the graph so that the graph can verify that I have rights to make the request that I'm making. And I'm going to get the web so I can get the web ID, and then I'm going to get the list for that particular web. All right, so if I've done everything correctly, I should be able to now just go Control F5 to run my console application. Oh, no, I haven't done everything correctly. And we'll just stop. I actually have to call that method to get the SharePoint lists. So get SharePoint lists. Now I can do Control F5. All right, so there's the access token that I got back from Azure. So Azure, my app authenticated with Azure for that app and said, okay, you've authenticated, here's your access token. Then I've gone and got the SharePoint web. So here's the ID for that web in the Microsoft graph, right? So it's the tenant name and then two GUIDs, right? The site collection GUID and the site GUID. And then I use that to go get the lists for that specific site, and there are the actual lists. So again, I did this using app permissions. So even though I could have technically authenticated this app because I'm running in a console, so I could have popped up a dialog so I could authenticate as a user, I'm not doing that because we're using app permissions. Okay, so any questions at all on that stuff before we move back to the slides? I will take that as a no. All right. So I talked about MSAL, right? So it is the library that we can use to do the authentication and do token exchange with Azure AD. There are multiple versions of MSAL. So there's MSAL for Android, Angular, iOS, macOS, MSAL for Go, Java, MSAL.js, which you would use if you're doing JavaScript or TypeScript, MSAL.net, that's what I used. I used the .NET framework version of that library. There's a .NET Core version as well. You can do Node, MSAL Python, and MSAL React. React is actually new. I think it's like less than a month old. They added in a React version of MSAL. Okay. So there are lots of versions of MSAL that you can use. There are also, whoops, sorry, I didn't want to do that. Lots of libraries that wrap MSAL. So Microsoft Identity.web is one example of a library that wraps MSAL. In the case of Microsoft Identity.web, which is the library we'll use in the next demo, it basically completely obfuscates away from you the use of MSAL, right? Which you can argue is both a good thing and a bad thing, right? So it's a good thing in it simplifies the code that you have to write, but it's a bad thing in that if something goes wrong, it's not obvious where you go to look to try to fix the thing that went wrong or try to identify what exactly went wrong. So Microsoft Identity.web is specifically for use with .NET Core web apps or web APIs. Okay, so if you build a .NET Core console application or a WinForms application, you don't use Microsoft Identity.web. It's specific for web applications. There is a .NET framework version of it, but I don't know how you actually get it to work. So I think it was like maybe started and not finished or whatever. I played around with it and I could never really get it to work. It seems somewhat incomplete. So with the .NET framework, that you would still just use MSAL. But I specifically bring up Microsoft Identity.web is because all of the .NET 5 project templates that are web-based use Microsoft Identity.web. So it is important that you understand that and how to use it if you're going to build .NET Core applications. I talked about app registration and the app registration portal. So we went over all this stuff. Again, the app ID or the client ID, very important. It uniquely identifies that specific app. You basically always use that ID. So you just go to the overview option in the secondary left-hand nav in the portal to get to it, find where the application ID is. I talked about the different flows, right? So they're dependent on the type of application that you're building and if there's a signed-in user. Okay, I'll talk more about specifics around authentication flows a little bit later on in the session. Talked about client certificates and client IDs, right? So not all of the auth flows require that you have a client secret or a certificate, but the ones that do, you can use either one, and they identify, they basically become the password for the app. Now, in my example, I put the client secret right in my code. That is not a best practice. So whether you're using a client secret or a certificate, you should put that in some kind of secure store. Generally, that's going to be Azure Key Vault. But you don't. There's other secure stores as well that you can use. You don't want to have that in your code, right? Because basically here, anybody who knows these two values, they're the username and password for the app. So if you know that the username and password and you know that it talks to Microsoft Graph, then you could go and write an app right now that goes and reads out of my tenant, right? So those things shouldn't, you need to protect those values because they're basically a user within your tenant, right? Effectively, it's a non-interactive user. So now, really depending on the scope, like I did sites.read.all. Now, maybe there's, in one of my sites, there's, payroll information or stuff about like IP around our new product. So that would be not something that I want anybody to be able to go and get, right? So make sure that you protect that stuff. And there's lots of resources to talk about how to protect those secrets using Key Vault or other secure stores. So I showed you that. I talked about the redirect URIs. So again, you have to configure that in your application. Azure cannot send an ID token, which we'll talk about later on, or an access token to your app if you haven't registered the URI for the redirect URI for that app that's going to receive that token. Okay, and you can't use wildcard URIs. So you have to specifically say, like, let's say, for example, it's a web forms app. You have to specifically say what's the URL to the page that's going to receive the access token. Okay, you can have multiple redirect URIs. I think you can have like up to 256 of them. That would be unusual, but you can have multiple redirect URIs. I talked about permission requests, right? So there's static permission requests. Those are the ones that you define in the Azure portal itself. Dynamic permission requests are the ones that you define in your code. You only use dynamic permission requests when you have a signed in user. And you can request those permissions incrementally. I talked about the two different permission types, right? Delegated permissions are only used when there is a signed in user. And the effective permissions are the intersection of the user permissions and the app permissions. Whereas application permissions can be used when there is a user or there isn't. When there isn't a user, you're using them because there isn't a user. So there's no way you can authenticate on behalf of or delegate to a user. When there is, you're generally using them because the user might not have permission to perform the action that you need to perform. Application permissions can only be granted by a tenant admin or an Azure application admin. Some delegated permissions can be consented by the user themselves. Some of the more broad permission requests actually have to be consented by an admin. Okay, even though it's delegated permissions, the broader requests have to be consented by an admin, and it tells you in the portal if you want API permissions and then add a permission. it'll tell you whether or not an admin has to consent to permission request. It'll also show that here. So I talked about permission scopes, right? So permission scopes, if you write them in code, are defined by the resource URI and then the permission being requested. So for example, graph.microsoft.com/calendars.read. If you're making a request for the Microsoft Graph, you can leave off the resource identifier. So calendars.read is the same as graph.microsoft.com/calendars.read. There's other dialogues that you'll see come up, and we'll see an example of one a little bit later on. But basically, when you can see a consent dialog like this, this side shows the user consent, so the user's consenting on behalf of themselves, right? And then what permissions are being requested by the app will be shown here. So you can consent for yourself. If you have the appropriate permissions within the tenant, you can also consent on behalf of all users. So you can consent for yourself if you don't check this box, or you can consent for all users if you do check that box. And there's other dialogues that are specific to admin consent for all users where the box isn't there because the dialogue is only used to consent on behalf of all users. Okay, so this is where Azure AD is saying this app is requesting these specific permissions. Do you want to consent those permissions? And the only way you can use the app is if you say, yes, I consent to permissions. Okay, it's very, very similar to like consenting permissions in a mobile app store and so on. For user consent, the way that you see the apps that you've consented to and manage them is in the My Applications portal. So you go to myapplications.microsoft.com and you'll see all of the applications that you've consented to or that have been consented for you by default. For example, like lists and so on. And you can actually manage those applications. So like if you consented for something and you no longer want that consent to be around, you can revoke the consent for that app. I actually don't have a slide for it, but I'll show you. On the enterprise side, if you go to Azure Active Directory and then Enterprise Applications, here's where you manage the applications that have been admin consented. Okay, so you can see like I have lots of different applications that I've built in the past. So those are all there, and there's also other like Graph Explorer, Microsoft Teams, OneNote, Yammer, and so on. Okay, so this is where you do it on the enterprise side rather than on the user side. So I forgot to include a slide on that. All right, so I've talked about access tokens, right? So there are a few different kinds of tokens you can get when you authenticate with Azure AD, and not all flows return all the different kinds of applications, right? So if you're going to call a protected resource, you always need an access token. That's just a given. Okay. Access tokens are short-lived. Up to recently, they live for an hour by default. They will, depending on if you've configured this thing called continuous access evaluation, which is a little bit beyond the scope of this particular talk, but they can last a little bit longer if you're using that. But basically, for the purposes of this discussion, let's just say they last for an hour, and that's what you use to call the protected resource, or basically to authenticate, to tell the protected resource that yes, I have been given permissions to access the resources that I am requesting. Okay. Some of the authentication flows will also return what's called a refresh token. So you can use a refresh token to silently get a new access token if the access token has expired or is about to expire. Okay, so you won't get presented with any kind of dialogue. you can just, as long as you have a refresh token that's valid, you can use it to go get a new access token. And the refresh token lives basically forever by default, as long as you use it within every 90-day period, right? So if you haven't used it for 90 days, it will expire, and then you'll have to go get a new access token and refresh token. So you'll basically have to go through the entire the startup authentication process to be able to do that. Another thing that's important is you need to cache these tokens. I won't talk about it in specifics, but you do need to have a token cache in your in certain kinds of applications, so that you can get access to these tokens across like a session or whatever. Generally, you'll want to store them in some kind of persistent store, like SQL or the other kind of persistent stores. And then finally, there's an ID token. Okay, so the only real value of the ID token is to get profile information about the current user, right? So generally, like ID tokens are used for sign in, sign out, but you don't use ID tokens at all to access protected resources. There is one other thing, which is called an authorization code, which is not actually a token, but it is used in one of the authentication flows. So actually, it's the flow we're going to use in the next demo. Okay, so in the next demo, what happens is when the user logs in, they're given an authorization code, and then they can exchange that authorization code for an access token. So the token exchange process is actually a two-step process. But the authorization code is only used in the authorization code flow. So that's the flow that's represented right here. So these are the different kinds of authentication flows, and then the description of the different flows, and then what kind of apps you'll use them in. So at this point, I'll break for any questions, if there are any. It looks like there aren't.
I've got a quick question for you, Rob.
Yeah.
This is Mike. I'm curious if this same platform, this may be a little bit off topic here, but I'm not really sure. Is this the same platform that can also be used to do like single sign-on type of authentication? And how is that related? Or if that is a completely different thing, in what way is that a completely different thing?
I think it kind of depends on what, like, single sign-on in what context.
Well, like, say, for example, I have some clients that I'm working with that are using completely different sets of usernames and passwords for some of their applications that live on-prem. And I was really interested to see if I could figure out how to get them to be able to utilize their Azure identities to log on to those in a secure way.
Yeah, so
that's remove a layer of administration for them.
Okay, so in that context, this isn't really applicable.
Okay. All right, fair enough. I'm just demonstrating how little I know about this. That's all.
Yeah, like something like Okta would be a solution in that in that area.
Yeah.
But there is, like, single sign-on is something like, for example, if I want to call the graph from a Teams application, right? In that case, this is important in regards to this, or it plays in the single sign-on process, right? But in the context that you're talking about, it really doesn't.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Sorry, was there a follow-up there?
Nope, all set.
Okay, cool. All right, so in this case, I'm going to create a .NET Core ASP.NET MVC application. So I'll just go ahead and create that app. Okay. And in this case, I want to use delegated permissions to have a page that shows the user's events. Okay. So let's go register an app for that. So let me come back here and just grab this. So I'll just open up another tab with the app registration portal. And I'll create a new registration. And this will be boss 365, authorization code MVC. Let's do a multi-tenant app in this case. Okay. And there is a redirect URI, but I'm going to show you where to put this in another part of the registration. So I'll go ahead and click register here. So again, we have our application ID here. The first thing I'm going to do is go to authentication and then add a platform. So last time I chose mobile and desktop apps. This time I'm going to choose web. So it's going to ask me a different set of questions here. So the redirect URI I want is this one. Actually, I want two of them. I'll configure one here. So that's going to be where my app runs locally. Do I want a logout URL? I actually have a logout URL, so I'll do that. So I'll grab, this is the logout URL. So this is using OpenID Connect. Basically, the project template has the sign in and sign out all built into it. And I want an ID token. So I'm going to say that I want an ID token here. And I'll click configure. Okay. Now there's a second redirect URI that I need, so I'll add that in here. It's this one. So I'll come back and say add URI and then paste that in and then click save. Okay. So in this case, I'm going to use dynamic permission requests. So I'm not going to configure permissions here in the portal. But in this particular flow, I do need a client secret. So let's go and create one of those. So I'll say new client secret. Again, I'll just say boss 365. You can configure how long this lasts. There's some default values, or you can put a custom value in there. I'll copy that and I'll replace the one that's here. And I think that is everything I need to do here. Okay, so let's come over to our app. Let's just open this up in Visual Studio Code. So as I mentioned, this app uses Microsoft Identity.web, and it uses another part of that library. Microsoft Identity.web is actually a few different packages. So it uses Microsoft Identity.web and Microsoft Identity.web.ui. But right now it's using older versions of those. So I want to update the versions it's using. So I'll just go and add in some NuGet packages here. So I'll update Microsoft Identity.web. And I will update Microsoft Identity.web.ui. And there's also a Microsoft Graph package, which we can use. So I'll grab that as well, because I'm going to be working with the Microsoft Graph. So let's just grab that. Okay. So now if I come back to code and open up the project file, you can see I'm using a newer version, so 1.16 of those libraries. Okay, so let's see. I need to set up my app config. So Microsoft Identity.web is configured to work with app settings. So in the console app, I put the settings right in the code. Microsoft Identity.web is configured to use settings that are configured here in your app settings file. One of them is this downstream API. So here are the permission scopes that I'm requesting. It's user.read. Whoops. Try that again. Oh, you can see it right there. So user.read and calendars.read. And again, I haven't specified the resource URI, so that's Microsoft Graph. And the base URL is where I say that I'm using the v1 endpoint rather than the beta endpoint. Okay, so that's where I configure the API that I want to use. And then up here is where I configure information about my app. So what's the domain for my tenant? Just grab that by going to any user and then grabbing the end part of their email. So it is, oh, that's the instance. I don't want to do that. I want to do this. What's my tenant ID? I showed you can get that from the app registration overview right here, tenant ID. So put that in there. And what's the client ID? Again, client ID and application ID are the same thing. So that's this guy right there. So now I've set up the app settings. Next thing I want to do is go to my startup. And so Microsoft Identity at Web configures all of the authentication with Azure AD and the token exchange and everything through a set of middleware. So this is what you get by default. We wanted to update that. Okay. So I'll replace that code with this. Okay, so I'm going to go read the scopes, the permission scopes that I want through that part of the configuration file. So downstream API : scopes. And I'm basically creating an array. So those were separated by a space. I'm telling Microsoft Identity.web to configure itself using the configuration settings I put in the Azure AD section. So that was the client ID, the tenant ID, and so on. What are the scopes that I want? What are the scopes that are defined in the app config? And the same thing with the Microsoft Graph. Its config is through the downstream API. And I talked about token cache. So in this case, it's going to do an in-memory token cache. So it'll only last as long as the web server is running. Okay. So you can, there's other token caches you can get. You can create your own custom token cache. But basically, you can see that that is doing, or through configuration, basically saying how I want all the stuff to work behind the scenes. And then the Microsoft Identity.web library will manage creating the public public application and doing the authentication and getting the tokens and caching them and all that other stuff for you. Okay. So as I mentioned, it simplifies the process, but it also obfuscates the process. And I just realized there was one other thing I needed to do in the app settings, is I need to add in that client secret. So I need to say here, client secret is, this value right here. Save that. Okay. So this is the startup. Configure services, where I'm configuring all that middleware that will do all that magic for me. And now I want to create a controller. So as I mentioned, I want to show event information. So I'll create a controller called Calendar Controller. So under controllers, I'll just create a new file called Calendar Controller. And then the code for that will look like this. Okay, so here's the constructor, and it's taking in a logger and this graph service client. So this is, again, all being done by Microsoft Identity.web for me, right? This dependency injection where I can just ask for these things, and through dependency injection, I'll be given them. Okay, so the graph service client is part of the Microsoft Graph SDK. In the previous example, I interacted with the graph by making HTTP requests to the graph service. In this case, I'm using an SDK, which wraps all that for me. Okay, so I can get a graph service client object, which gives me access to the SDK through this dependency injection. So here I'll use that graph service client that's given to me. And I'll say that I want to use the graph service client.me.events, right? So if I go here to the Microsoft Graph Explorer, right, that code inside of the SDK will basically create a HTTP request that is graph 1.0/me/events. Okay, and that will give me information about the events in my calendar. Okay, so that's what's happening behind the scenes. And it will also take the JSON that comes back and put it into actual types for me. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to make that request, and then it's going to give me an array of objects that have the information that comes back about the events. So what's the start date? What's the end date? What's the name of or who initiated the event? What's the name of the event, and so on. Okay, and again, that's all coming back to me in strongly typed objects. So I don't have to know what the JSON looks like. I can use IntelliSense to do all that. Okay. So that's the code that will go get the event and update, convert from UTC to the local time zone. And then now I need to show the events. So I need to go down to Views and create a new folder called Calendar. And then I need to create a new file in there called index.cshtml. And then I need to put the Razor code in to show the events. Okay, so basically I'm going to be given an IEnumerable of the Microsoft.graph.event. And I'm just going to loop through those and create a table that shows the name of the organizer, the subject of the event, and then the start and date time converted into my local time rather than a UTC. Okay, so I should be able to now go do a .NET build. And do a .NET run. And it'll start up my my app locally. And while it's starting, let's just open up a new incognito version of Edge. That way I don't have any issues with caching of tokens if this doesn't work the way I expect it to. So let me just grab the URL that this is being served up on. So this user is Rob at robwindsor.986.onmicrosoft.com. Okay, so this is the permission dialog, consent dialog. Okay, so it's asking me, do you want to consent to this application? This application wants to sign in and read your profile, maintain data that you've given access to, and read my calendars. Okay. Now I'm a tenant admin, so I have the choice right now of consenting on behalf of my entire organization. I'm not going to choose to do that. I'm only going to consent on behalf of me as this specific user. So I'll go ahead and click accept here. Okay, so it shows me the welcome page. And you can see that it knows who I am. It did that through the ID token that came back when I authenticated. And now I can go ahead and go to the calendars. Calendars. I think it was calendars. Oops. Calendar. And now I can see the events that are in my calendar. So Penske project status update, company retreat, project kickoff, team lunch, and website design. I didn't filter this, so old events are coming in as well. So I could have done a filter on the request to have only events that are today or later, but I didn't specifically do that. And I'm the organizer of all these events. Okay, so let's go to another user in my tenant here, right? So this is Adele, right? So Adele has a team lunch today, a virtual happy hour next week. Adele has the Penske project kickoff. There's also a Penske project status update. So let's go open up a tab here and log in as Adele. Okay, so again, I'm seeing the same consent dialog. Adele is not an admin, so I don't have the option to consent for all users. I only have the option to consent for Adele. So I'll do that. I'll click accept here. And now you can see there's the virtual happy hour, the project status, right? There's a company all hands that Patty Fernandez organized a while ago. So there you can see Adele's events. Okay. Now I made this a multi-tenant app, so I should be able to use this for other tenants as well. So let's go. Let's try this one here, Lee. Okay, so this is Lee Gu from a different tenant altogether. I have no idea what events Lee has in his schedule. So Lee needs to sign in. So which tenant is this? 983, okay. So that would be Lee G at Rob Windsor test 983.onmicrosoft.com. And then the password. Okay, so Lee's calendar. Hopefully Lee has events. I can't remember if he does or not. So now let's go open up another tab here, and then grab the URL to the app and go back to Lee, and do this, and pick Lee. Okay, so I'm getting an error here. Selected user count does not exist in tenant Rob Windsor test 986. Well, that's odd because I configured the app to be multi-tenant, right? If we go back to the app config here, and authentication, we can see here that it is configured for that. So why is that happening? The reason that's happening is because I misconfigured the, well, I intentionally misconfigured the app config for the app itself, right? So again, if you don't know this, it may not be obvious where to look. Obviously, you can Google and look at documentation. But in the app settings here, when I specified this tenant ID, doing that said, when the authority, right? Let's come back to here and take a look at the authority, right? The authority was for my tenant. So even though I configured the app to allow users from multiple tenants, I configured the authentication to say, no, only allow people from my tenant. So if I want multiple tenants, I have to change this from the tenant ID to common. Okay. And from my point of view, this is where this stuff becomes really complex, right? Because once you start to get into working with multiple authentication flows and different kinds of applications and single tenant and multi-tenant, exactly how you configure your app and use it can become difficult to understand. Okay, and really, I mean, it just comes through, you've done it, you Googled it, oh yeah, I figured that out and now I know it. And, basically the pain of failure teaches you, right? But again, it's not super obvious what you would do there, and trying to figure out what to do is also not super obvious. So it can take a while for that to happen. But now let's go over here and just stop my app and rebuild it. And run it again. Right, so now let's go back and just run the app again for Lee. Okay, so it's saying need admin approval. But if you remember, in my tenant, Adele was able to consent, but Lee isn't. This is actually a relatively new change. So in multi-tenant apps, when you use the app from a different tenant, it will require admin approval, even if within your tenant, individual users can consent. Okay, unless you register as an app. Sorry, I'm blanking on the specific name of this, but basically there's a registration process you can go with this to certify your tenant so that you can be a verified publisher. That's what I was doing. So if you're a verified publisher, then users can consent in other tenants, but only if you're a verified publisher. And there's a process you need to go through for that to work. Okay, so what I need to do is go for 983, open up a tenant admin, and then go to the app. Now I can consent on behalf of all users here for my tenant. Okay. And I don't have any events. Let's see if Lee has any events. Lee does. Okay. So there you go. So now I'm using an app in one tenant that is implemented and registered in another tenant, right? And that's how multi-tenant works. Now, app registrations, every app has a single app registration. Whoops, I got way too many windows open here, right? So this is the app registration for this specific app. But apps can have multiple service principal. So for every tenant where the app is in use, there's also a service principal, right? So there's one app registration, and in this case, there's two service principals, one in the app and the tenant where I registered the app, and one in the tenant where I just used it. Okay. So again, that's a little bit of an advanced thing, but it is something that is just important to understand. So for every app where you use a multi-tenant app, there is something that represents that app. It's called the service principal. Okay. All right. So any questions? And oh, sorry, this app used the authorization code flow. But again, that was completely abstracted away from you, how that flow works, what you need to do with the authorization code, and then to exchange that for the access token. That was completely abstracted from you by Microsoft Identity.web. But that was the flow that was used in this particular app. So any questions on that?
I have a quick question. This service principal that you were talking about, so
Yeah.
Does that become the component that a tenant administrator would then revoke if they wanted to kick out an app?
Okay, so let's go back to here. Let's make sure I'm in the right, Rob. So he's the admin, right? So if I go to portal.azure.com, and then go to, oh, okay. Well, just go, well, here, manage Active Directory. That's what I want. So enterprise applications, that's this here. I would do it through here, right? So there's the application right there. So within this tenant, that's how I would revoke the rights to that app. And this entry is in here because of the service principal in this tenant.
Okay, so if you were to revoke that now, what would happen to the service principal? Would the service principal stay in there as an entry that is marked?
That's a great question. I don't know. I don't know the answer to your question. I don't know if the service principal gets deleted or if it stays.
Interesting.
But that's how you manage it right there.
Okay.
Any other questions? Okay, so one last thing. I'm okay on time, right, guys?
We're starting to come up on time, but yeah, you're doing good.
Okay, I'll try to get through this last part quickly. What about SharePoint Framework? So I have a SharePoint Framework web part project here, okay? And I want to call the Microsoft Graph. So I just created the project. I didn't do anything with it, right? So it's a web part using it's not using React. It's using just JavaScript, okay? But I want to call the Microsoft Graph. Do I register an app and all that stuff? No, don't do any of that. The way you do this in the SharePoint Framework, and I just want to use moment for date formatting, so I'm just going to go and add that in here. Let me close this guy off. So I need to go to config JSON and add this as an external resource. Is in your package solution, you make a web API permission request. Okay. So this is how you specifically say that I want to use a resource from the graph or from any other protected API or your own custom APIs. And then what permission scope do you want from that? In this case, I want calendars.read. Okay. So this project is declaring that it's requesting that permission. Okay. So now I just have a couple other sort of housekeeping things to do, like I need to declare some CSS classes. So I do that down here. And then I think I need some imports. So the API that you use to talk to the graph, you would normally use one called the Graph Client, Microsoft Graph Client. But since this talk is really about Azure AD, the sort of generic or type that you use within the SharePoint framework to talk to Azure AD is the AAD HTTP client. So that's the one I'm going to use. You can use it to talk to the graph, but there is another type in the SharePoint framework that's specific for the graph. I'll show you how to do it without using that. And then I want to use moment for date formatting, so I need to import that as well. All right, so here's the code that will go and get events. So again, I want to get events for the current user. So I'm just going to replace the current render method with that code. Okay, so I want to use the AAD HTTP client factory to create an AAD HTTP client object, and I want to do create a client that can talk to the graph. So here I'm using the resource identifier for the graph. That's a asynchronous call. So once that promise completes, then I want to make a request to my graph.microsoft.com v1 me.events. So get events for me. Okay. When that completes, I want to clear the loading indicator. I want to check to see, did that call complete successfully? So I want to check response OK. If response OK is false, then it didn't complete successfully, and I want to show the error message. Okay. Otherwise, I want to go get the JSON that represents the events. So that JSON will have a property called value, which is an array of event objects. And I want to format those into the body of a responsive grid. So I'm using the Office UI Fabric grid, or what do they call it now? The Office Fluent, or the Fluent UI grid, to render a table. So basically, I'm doing exactly the same thing I did using .NET code here using TypeScript. Okay. And then I just want to go and render that grid out to the web part body. Okay. So that's my code. Now, to make SharePoint aware that I'm requesting that permission, I need to put that that package into the app catalog. So I'll do a gulp bundle -- ship. And hopefully that won't take too long. And I have, yep, I have the pages that I need up. It always, in any presentation, when you're getting a little bit short on time, it will always just wait and wait and wait because it annoys you. Okay, I'm not going to wait for this. What I'm going to do is just cheat like Julia Child and use the turkey that's already cooked in the oven. So CD boss 365 CD SPFX 8. So I'm just going to grab that URL. I actually probably have it here. Dev prep. Okay, so this one doesn't have the solution package built, so I have to wait anyway. Shoot. Okay, I'll try one more time. If it doesn't start up real quick, then I'll just move on to the slide and I can show you. So it was gulp bundle -- ship. Okay, there we go. This normally takes like half a minute to complete. While that's just finishing up, actually just finished now, okay. And then I need to gulp package -- solution -- ship. This will run really quickly. So dev boss 365 SharePoint solution. So that's the solution package that just got created. So I'll grab that URL and I'll come over to my app catalog. And I will go ahead and upload that package. Okay, so notice at the bottom there, it says, please go to the API management page to approve pending permission request. What requests are being requested? Calendars.read from Microsoft Graph. Okay, so I'll go ahead and click deploy. And then over here in the SharePoint Admin Center, if you go to Advanced and then API Access, there is a page which shows you the permissions that have been requested and the permissions that have been granted within this tenant. So if I refresh that page, I should now see Microsoft Graph calendars.read. So because I put that app in the app catalog, SharePoint recognized, oh, there's a permission request in here that hasn't already been granted. So I'm going to show it here and allow the tenant admin to choose whether to approve or reject that permission request. So I can select that and then say approve. And then approve here. And now that permission request is approved. So now I can go and actually use that web part. Okay. So I can go to pages and create a new site page. I'll call this boss 365. And then go to my web part gallery. And then there should be SPFX AAD HTTP client. And there you can see my events shown in the web part. Okay, so with SharePoint, Microsoft creates an Azure AD app registration, and that is managed through this process. You don't go into the Azure portal and manage it. You do it through this permission request and permission grant process that I just showed you. Okay. So just a last bit, I'm not going to go through these slides in detail, but there's a slide on each of the different auth flows that talks a little bit more about it. Talked about the Sharepoint framework, right? There's the MS Graph client. I talked about that. Declaring permission requests, you do that in your package solution JSON. There is where you go to manage those requests. And then a slide with a couple different resources. So the documentation on the identity platform, and then also a Microsoft learning path that has several courses inside of it, which shows you stuff I've showed you, plus a lot more, like, for example, how to create a web API that you then call, and how to create custom permission scopes on that web API. Talks about role-based security. There's lots of other things that are covered in that course. All right, so I'm sorry that I went a little bit long, but as I mentioned, there's my contact info. I sent the slide deck, PDF of the slide deck to Dimitri, Mike, and Bill. So they'll be able to disseminate that or get that out to you. And if you have any other questions that we don't have time to cover here, feel free to just contact me via email or on Twitter. So thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Rob.
So are there any other questions, or is there a sort of a finish up that you want to do for the user group?
Yeah, Rob, we have a few slides to close out, but we can pause here for a minute if anyone has any questions for Rob. All right, so in that case, Rob, thank you very much. I think this was great. Let me pass the mic back to Mike Dixon to walk us through the closing slides. And Mike, you are on mute.
Yeah, I'm on my way. Give me 1 second. Thank you very much for that, Rob. That was awesome.
Thank you.
Very enlightening. Definitely a lot in there that I was not familiar with.
Yeah, understanding the AD, like it's taken me a long time to get to where I am, and I don't think I truly understand it the way I want to, but you know, now I understand it to a level that I can build applications and be comfortable that I'm not making the wrong choices. But it takes a long time to get there.
All right.
Oh.
Did you have a question, Christy?
Oh. I actually put it in the chat, but I'm not sure if you saw it. With that said, and granted, I'm an Azure newbie, and your talk was excellent. It's like my head is all spinning. But it was good though. But with that said, I mean, you said that even yourself, you went through a long path. From your own knowledge, what would you say is your lessons learned for those that are, you know, getting up to speed, or let's say your top three. We'll keep it short, if it can be top three.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's a hard question to answer, because really it's kind of, the complexity is in the fact that the way you do things is different depending on the kind of application you're building and what kind of permissions you're requesting, right? So like the way I go through and do the authentication and get to the access token and stuff in a console app, or, you know, like I showed you, is way different than I would do it if I'm building an MVC application, and it's different if I'm building an MVC application that uses .NET Framework or .NET Core, which is different than how I do it in JavaScript and TypeScript, which is different than how I do it in Sharepoint Framework, which is different than how I do it in Teams. So it's really all of these differences, like underlying everything, you're still doing the same thing, but how you do it is different, and that's where the complexity lies. So there's really no like magic path. It's just, you have to try that particular scenario and figure it out, and then, either remember it or write it down somewhere so that you can go back and remember where do I go to remember what that path is, right? So unfortunately, I can't really give you a sort of succinct answer to your question. It's really just try it, see how it works, get it working, and then try to remember what you did.
Okay, no, that's good. Thanks, Rob. So basically, to echo Nike, just do it.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
All right. Thanks again, Rob.
And we updated our webpage for the presentation, so you can download the slides there.
All right. So with that, we wanted to dive in real quick, see if anybody has anything outside of what Rob was just talking about, but actually if you think of something, any questions related to the identity platform, that's fine as well. Anybody have any other questions or tips or tricks just generally about Office 365 or any of the fun Microsoft announcements or happenings for the past couple of months?
I have one. It relates to the intro stuff you did. So one of the things that you mentioned is collapsible sections on site pages.
Yes.
I don't know if it's been fixed or not, but I know for sure the news and activity web parts have issues. If you collapse a section, expand it, and then collapse it again, they won't render correctly. I don't know if that affects any other web parts or if that's been fixed, but as of like 2 weeks ago or 10 days ago, that was an issue that people were aware of, and Microsoft's aware of it.
Okay. Well, that's good to know. Thank you for sharing. That's awesome.
But a refresh would probably solve the problem too.
Yeah, if you refresh the page, it'll render correctly again.
Right. Which I have to do quite often on a GCC because it can run into problems.
Okay.
Can I ask a quick question about two-factor authentication for email?
Sure.
We have a client who was given access to some other company's email, trying to put it in Outlook, and it keeps rejecting it. Is there some setting in the Microsoft 365 control that says you're allowing an app like Outlook to connect to email? I recall this from a while ago.
So Arthur, are you referring to application passwords?
Yeah, when the email address is put into Outlook, adding an address, you put in the password and it keeps cycling through saying, no, put in the password, no, put in the password.
Which version of Outlook are you using?
2019.
And the email system, is that Office 365?
Yes.
Have you changed your password recently?
I don't know. This is some new connection that this person wants to have to an outside address.
So I noticed if you change your password recently, sometimes you have to lock your desktop, unlock it again to get things in sync.
Right.
Whenever, like, yeah.
Yeah, that's a DirSync issue.
Yeah, the other thing too, if you open up your Credential Manager on your Windows device, I would recommend just clearing out any stored credentials that you might have in there for Office products, and then just do a clean authentication next time you log in.
Okay.
And just another test, Arthur, the other thing that they could try to do is use an incognito browser, because that helps to like clear the slate, per se. So to help, yeah.
Yeah, if they use webmail, it works, but I'm trying to put it into Outlook to make it simpler.
So to troubleshoot Outlook issues, I like to right-click on the system tray, the Outlook icon, and open your Connection Manager. Is that what it's called? I think it's Connection Manager. Connection Status, it's called. And then you can actually see what's happening. It gives a little bit more detailed information.
Thank you.
There's also a connectivity tool online that you can utilize as well, where you can do basically synthetic logons as all kinds of different users and test to see how that would respond. And that's very helpful. All right. I've got one for the group. I've been doing a ton of work in Power Apps recently, and I'm running into a problem where I have a flow that is being kicked off by, it's being kicked off by a process in Power Apps, and then it's reporting back to Power Apps, and I'm responding back to the Power App with a SharePoint ID number. And even if I specify that that SharePoint ID number is an integer, it comes up with a variable mismatch in Power Apps because it says that it's a string and not an integer. Any ideas? Anybody ever run into something like that? Or even if you haven't run into that, is there any way to force a variable in Power App to be a specific type of variable? Like I know in PowerShell, I can specify the type of a variable if PowerShell is guessing it wrong, which happens on occasion.
Can't you just take it as an integer, as a string, and then convert it in Power Apps?
I can't because there are other processes. I would love to do it that way, but there are other processes that are also feeding into that same thing, and they are properly identifying it as an integer.
Old hack was to set a value before you pull in the actual value. That way you had an integer value. That was an old hack in the early days.
Yeah.
Mike, I think I don't have a solution for you because I'm not really sure, but my best advice is seriously tweet out the basic query, the very last question in terms of the integer conversion, tag Power Addicts, and seriously, you'll get hopefully and even tag like the usual suspects like April. Kavitha. I'm trying to remember her name. Begins with
April Dunham?
No, April. But I'm thinking there's a tag April and Kavitha.
Shane Young.
Jane who?
Shane Young.
Shane Young.
Yes.
Oh, well, yeah, Shane Young, yeah, and for that matter, even Laura Rogers as well, and even Anton Robbins. But if you just do hashtag Power Addicts, they'll see it, and I think that's my suggestion with something like this.
All right. Yeah, I'll give that a shot. I'm familiar with the Power Addicts group. I own one of their t-shirts.
Oh, just a general info. Windows 11 hit my Surface 3 laptop, and it rocks. I'm loving it already. I still have to play around with it, but yeah, I'm liking Windows 11.
Okay. All right. I did also have a couple of polls I wanted to hit you guys with. Oh, that's awesome. So one of the questions that I had is how you guys would like us to cover updates. Okay. we've gotten to a point where I'm not sure if we're just getting better at finding them or Microsoft's being more transparent about putting them out there, but we get a lot more information about updates than we used to in the past. And I'm curious if you guys are interested in us kind of curating the ones that we feel are most significant and doing a deeper dive on just a handful of them, or if you like kind of the broader overview that we've done for the past 3 or 4 months. So let us know, vote in the poll.
Or I would say even tweet out the poll.
You and your social media, Chris. I mean, come on.
Well, why not?
You know, Twitter's just your answer to everything.
Hey, the Microsoft community, you'll find them on Twitter. Seriously.
All right, fair enough. I will do that. All right. But yeah, take a look. Try to do. For those of you that are here now, please vote on that and let us know what you think. And I will move on to the next slide and talk about some upcoming community events. Are people still doing community events? Is that a thing? It is. Look, we have a few community events. So we have Collab Days New England. That's coming up October 9th in Burlington, Massachusetts. And I wrote and virtual, but I'm not sure if this is actually and virtual. Does anybody know that? Okay, possibly and virtual.
I would say ping Chris McNulty. He'll probably know, right?
Yeah, well, I can reach out to Julie and find out. I know Julie, and Julie's actually running that event. So this is the event that is replacing what used to be the SharePoint Saturday New England. So SharePoint Saturday New England has basically been rebranded now as Collab Days New England. So, which is probably their way of bulletproofing it. We're not going to jump to M365 or O365 because, you know, Microsoft will change it right after we change that. So after that, we've got the Microsoft Collaboration Conference. That's way out in December. That's running from December 7th to December 9th, and that's in Las Vegas. So if anybody is up for a Christmas trip to Vegas, that could really hit the spot. And then, are we missing anything? Is anybody aware of any other big conferences or events that are going on?
I just posted in the chat with the M365 Friday San Lucas, which is actually a virtual event. Well, virtual event for the attendees, but the intention is that the speakers may be in Cabo.
Interesting. Okay.
Posted the link there. But to consume the data, it's virtual, and that's in November.
All right. SharePoint Fest. I think SharePoint Fest is passed, isn't it?
Yeah, I believe it was this past weekend.
Yeah.
Or week, rather.
Yeah, because I literally, we had SharePoint Fest on this slide, and I just took it off. All right. So moving on.
I just realized I thought of another one that's coming up in September, and it is virtual.
Okay.
The Dynamicon. Sorry, for those that are in the Power Platform, because even though that's the dynamic side of the business, but for those that are in the Power Platform, Power BI, Power Apps, Automate, sorry, that would apply. Hold on, let me think. pull up that exact.
Sure.
Shoot, I didn't flag the thing.
Okay.
I always forget. Hold on.
I was on mute, but that SharePoint Fest that I linked is DC. It's in September 20 to 24th.
Ah, okay. So that's the next SharePoint Fest. Gotcha.
Yeah.
Oh, nice.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you very much for that. We will add that to the slide.
I just posted DynamicsCon. That's September 20th to the 23rd, and it's virtual.
Awesome. Great logo. All right.
They're a cool group.
All right. So moving on, Microsoft has announced their new organization of their community calls and all of the new schedules for that. So this is what that is looking like as of right now. I would recommend keeping an eye on this particular page. We don't have the page reference anymore. The page reference is pnp.gethub.io.
I think it'll come up if you advance the slide. No?
No, it won't.
Okay. It's not there.
I just put it in chat. So yeah, so keep an eye on this. This is probably pretty tentative because this is a completely new format for them. And they did mention before they announced this that they were going to try it out and see what they think. So attend the ones that you like and give them lots of feedback. I can't recommend these calls enough. The people that join this are awesome. The things that they present are really, really inspiring. They give great ideas for new directions to take things and new ways to use stuff. And the Microsoft folks on the call have, in my experience, have always been incredibly responsive to feedback as to where they should prioritize things and what sorts of things people are trying to do and having issues with or wish that they could do but can't. So good stuff. Love these community calls. Oh, there it is. You're right. Oh, aren't we fancy? All right. So some more reoccurring resources throughout the community. These are our non-Microsoft specific ones, as in not sponsored by Microsoft explicitly. We've got the Women IT Pros, the Power Addicts, which we've already discussed a bit, and also the Power Hour. And we also have our sister group, the Rhode Island SharePoint User Group, and the Hartford Office 365 User Group, and the Granite State SharePoint User Group. We were supposed to check on that. Okay, get back to you on that one. And also, these two groups are still around. We've got the Boston Azure Meetup and the Power BI User Group Boston. These guys don't meet quite as frequently, but if you check these two web pages, you can get the latest and greatest from them. And one more time, just a huge thanks to Turn Digital for helping us keep everything running here. We really appreciate it. And also to all of our past sponsors. Wonderful stuff. If you guys know of anybody who's interested in sponsoring us, please send them our way or send us their information. You know, we're happy to reach out and explain what we can do for them. That'd be great.
Mike,
really
I just posted in the chat another community resource. Redgate. They're as you know, PASS basically dismantled, and Redgate took over. So for those that are, especially even on the Power BI folks and everything like that, that's the SQL stuff and data analysis. So, for those that may or may not be familiar, like with what was historically the past Summit, that is been taken over by Redgate. I posted the link there for the circle, though. I mean, for the community stuff.
Excellent. Thank you. We will add that to the deck. Thank you very much. And also, if you guys think of anything, throughout the next month or so, even before the meetings, feel free to email us or just post to this chat. This chat is live the whole time and available to everybody. So, just put a tag in there as to what it is and what slide we should put it on for our next session, and we're happy to do it. All right, very good, guys. We will see you. If for anybody that's interested in hanging out, we're gonna stop the recording,